Okay, the time is now 7 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started this evening. I'm Keegan Chetwin, the director at the Military Aviation Museum, and it's my pleasure to introduce everyone tonight to Dr. Dan Desko. I'd like to welcome Dr. Dan Desko. He's the founder and CEO of the B-25 History Project, as well as the vice president of his Community Historical Society there. He's internationally recognized as a B-25 historian with over 30 years kind of invested in the history of the B-25 aircraft type, as well as the specifics of North American's effort to produce them there in Fairfax, in Kansas City. So his particular story is really an interesting one. His interest starts with his grandparents, Harry Desko and Alice Desko, who both worked at the Kansas City plant, who both actually built B-25s during World War II. In 1988, they started an organization dedicated to honoring those men and women that built those airplanes, and that's continued to grow with the family members and other interested folks who've continued to take an interest in the history of the B-25. They have a digital archive, which is really remarkable. It's actually how I met Dr. Desko, was trying to access some of the files he had in his archive. There are 30,000 documents and a physical archive that contains over 2,000 artifacts. So he's basically the kind of keeper and custodian of the Fairfax B-25 history. Those of you probably know that B-25s were actually built in California as well, but the plant there in Kansas City was really set up to mass manufacture them. Our aircraft was built there along with many thousands of others. So without going too much further into the sort of juicy parts of his story, Dan, welcome. Thank you for being here with us, and thank you for planning to spend the evening with us sharing some of this history.
Well, thanks for having me, Keegan. You and I go back a long way, and I was kind of reminiscing a little bit about, kind of how you and I kind of got our started. And it obviously evolves around the B-25 for obvious reasons. So it's a great little story. I appreciate you thinking about me to be your little guinea pig with everybody else. It's awesome little experience, I think. This is a great technology. It's a great way for me to share my story and also to kind of tell you a little bit about us. So I'll just kind of get through this because unfortunately there's so much stuff to do. And, I could do like a 10-day lecture on this. And so we've got 45 minutes to make it happen, so let's get rolling here. So we'll talk a little bit about the B-25 History Project first. Just going to kind of run over this really quickly because I know probably a lot of people out there aren't familiar with who we are, what we do. So basically, it's a not-for-profit 501c3. Our mission is to preserve and honor the history of the B-25 bomber and the men and women who built, flew, and maintained them, past, present, and future. Well, that's kind of a mouthful to say, but it boils down to a lot more simple kind of different pieces. First of all, we're responsible for actually building some memorials. There is a memorial at the Wyandotte County Historical Museum. And we're also, sometime this year, are going to put up some signage down in Fairfax where these were built. It's a really neat little kind of project that we're doing with the local businesses that are still down there. We do a lot with education. Presentations like this, definitely among those. Preservation, obviously, our physical and our digital archive are definitely, among those. And we also do restorations. We have two current restoration projects that we're working on. One is our radio project, where we're going to restore back to working order 4 complete sets of radios that were in B-25s. That's both the liaison and the command radios. One of those sets is eventually going to go into Sandbar Mitchell. One of those sets we're going to keep and convert over to run on regular power. And then the other 2 sets we'll have for education and that kind of thing. The 8-gun nose project is a project we're going to start this year where we're actually going to restore an entire 8-gun nose section back to its original kind of form. We're actually going to put Hollywood 50s in there, so we'll be able to fire those off and kind of give everybody kind of at least a feeling of what it was like back in the day to have all that power up front in a B-25. So the public site, if you will, most of the people kind of get to know us through our website, b-25history.org. There's over 200 pages on there. We've got a biography section that we're building right now. You'll see one of those. We'll actually pull up the one for your airplane. But we don't have all of the airframes up there yet. We've got over 100 hours in each one of these biographies in terms of research and work and programming and that kind of stuff. So it takes us a little bit to do. And right now we're getting about just over a million page hits per year. Obviously, I mentioned that we were at the Wyandotte County Museum, also down in Fairfax with that stuff coming this year, as well as our internet presence. And we actually have provided information for lots of books, documentaries, and websites and stuff like that. So you'll see our credits, kind of all over the place. There in the middle of the picture there is my grandfather standing next to one of the projects that we did. This project was done back in 1996. I'm not in this picture, but this was a vertical tail section that we got, and you'll see all those goofy little lines on there. That's actually signatures of people that built them. It's about 110 signatures on that vertical tail of people that worked at the plant, what department they worked in, and that kind of stuff. There's the monument out front there that I designed. Again, my grandfather on the right there. Basically built to honor, the men and women that work there at the plant. Speaking of those people, there's one right there. It's my grandmother, Alice Desko. She was affectionately known as Send 'em Back Alice back in the day. She was an inspector in Department 54. Her inspection number was 457. She actually started as she worked as an artist before the plant, so she was very detail oriented. I think that's probably why she ended up with that job. So picture my grandfather. This was taken probably summer-ish, fall-ish of 1942. That is his North American Aviation uniform, if you will. He's got a nice little North American Aviation and his department badges there. He worked in Department 2. Basically, it was sheet metal. He did everything from punch press to riveting and all that other, shaping and just all sorts of things, whatever it took to get the job done. They called him Harmonica Harry because they actually had little presentations that were done kind of like a talent show, if you will, that my grandfather was involved in quite heavily, where he played harmonica, and that kind of carried him through the rest of his life as well. So there's myself. As Keegan kind of gave you the big chunks, that's me with Show Me. She's based out of St. Louis. The organization that my grandparents started actually in 88, 89, they sent a newsletter out quarterly it's kind of like a retirees newsletter. That's how I got involved with the project. At its peak, we were sending a newsletter to over 900 former bomber builders, and that kind of waned off, of course, as these people got old, and we kind of lost our readership basically because they were passing away. Eventually, my grandparents both passed several years ago, and I kind of took over everything from there. So what is a historian? Now, there is a doctorate in front of my name, but it's not a doctorate in history. I've got lots of degrees, but history isn't one of them. So why do I call myself a historian? Because I study history. I strive to preserve history. Typically, a historian will specialize. In my particular case, it's the B-25s, and particularly the ones that were built in Fairfax. I think historians should teach what they learn. They should explain without distorting the facts. And just kind of a little reminder that Wikipedia and Arcadia books are not valid resources. My particular focus, again, is about the B-25 and the Fairfax plant. So we're going to try a little technology shift here. Head on over to the website. Take just a moment to pull it up here. Here we go. This is my website, and this is the page with Wild Cargo, which is your aircraft. So this is everything. I should rephrase that. This is everything that's important to know about your airplane. So in terms of what it did and where it did. Now, at the time this was built, let's scroll down to the bottom here real quick. So it was completed in December of 1944, and that was about the time that we were building so many B-25s here in Kansas City that a lot of them were going straight to storage. But Wild Cargo didn't quite. Basically, she was initially assigned to a base in Arizona and was used as a trainer. And she stayed in that role pretty much all the way through her time with the military, which ended in December of 57. So after and then we do have a list of the major base assignments here, where she was at, what unit she was assigned to. She was converted to a TB-25K, which is basically just gutting the airplane, starting over. It's no longer a J, it's now a K. And that was done in Culver, California in 51. So essentially, when she was sold, she was really a lot different than what she was when she was built. So basically, how did she get into the civil market? How did she get, where she is now? little paragraph here kind of goes through the kind of who bought who, the what's, the wins, the wheres. It's been around a lot of times, had a lot of work done on her. And then kind of the details of where she was born and how she was born and that kind of stuff. So we've got her specific model number. She's a J25. The 25 is a block. Every B-25 was built in that block was absolutely identical when it came off the plant. Her serial number, her manufacturing number, her current registration number, where she was built, when she was completed, when she was delivered. So she was obviously completed before she was delivered to the military. And of course, she's still a flying B-25. I do actually have a link to another website here, which is a story that I'm sure some of you know about when she had a gear up landing. It's not technically a crash. She just couldn't drop her gear. And when she had all those nice, lovely little reptiles and stuff on board. So that's kind of how she got her name. I do have a picture of that, what she looked like on that day, down there as well. And there's a couple pictures up there. We can kind of scroll through what she looked like. That's when she was with Saplata. And this is kind of when she was first getting restored, and of course, when relatively fresh out of restoration. And then one of my favorite pictures of her. I'm sure there's probably better ones, but that's one of my favorites. That kind of gets put in there. So let's get back over to the presentation real quick. We know a little bit about her. All right, so let's talk about where she was born. So she's born in Fairfax Airport. Now, I'm talking Fairfax, I'm talking Kansas City. What's the difference? Well, it's kind of semantics, quite honestly. Nowadays, Fairfax is part of Kansas City, but back in the day, Fairfax was its own kind of little municipality, if you will, as many of them were in this area. It's basically, if you're looking at Kansas and you find Kansas City, it's almost to the river. As a matter of fact, it's on the Goose Island River bend of the Missouri River is where Fairfax is. And the airport itself dates back to 1921. Now, that's a little iffy information because of its age, but it was definitely an airport by 25 and so on and so forth. It first started out as actually the Fairfax Naval Air Station. That Fairfax Naval Air Station was actually started in 35 and went all the way up until pretty much North American kicked them out. And it was moved actually out to a little place called New Century, Kansas. It's now the Olathe Naval Air Station that's out there today. So this is an older picture, the B-25 being built there. In December 7th, 1940, exactly 1 year prior to Pearl Harbor. How coincidental is that? The government announced that they were going to build this plant here. It's going to be owned by the government and going to be run by North American Aviation, and they were going to build B-25s. So they got their first contract to do that back then. Now, this is a later picture of the plant, but of course, it gives you a good idea. It was a blackout building. There's no windows, no doors. It was air conditioned and heated. It was the largest building of the time that was both air conditioned and heated. Interestingly enough, a lot of wartime plants were camouflaged. They didn't have to camouflage this one because it was designed to look like a parking lot. If you look at the tops of those roofs, it's very flat, and from higher than 500 feet, you can't tell what it is. It just looks like a parking lot. And of course, obviously, you would have to be higher than 500 feet in order to bomb it. So they felt it was pretty safe. But they did indeed actually, build it very well, just in case, if you will. So details, a few little things about who built it, how they built it, and that kind of thing. Most of the work was completed by the Army Corps of Engineers. Basically, the government built this building for North American. So, oh, hey, that's a really horrible shot. There we go. So on groundbreaking day, we've got a group of people that came in. Payne Ratner, who was the governor at the time, Major A.M. Nielsen, he was the military's kind of in charge guy. And of course, James Kindleberger, who actually was running North American Aviation at the time, left to right as they speak there. It was March 8th, 1941. So literally 3 months after we announced we're going to build it, we're already breaking ground. So interesting little story here. That day, they dedicated Kindleberger Road after Mr. Kindleberger, obviously. Interestingly enough, sometime between now and then, in our astute government misspelled Kindleberger's name. It was done probably around 1960 or so when they replaced some signs and got it wrong. We were able to get them to change the signs back to correct this year. So that was kind of a win-win for us. Construction basically March, so literally 2 days after, 3 days, I guess, after we dedicated and did our groundbreaking, we're already, moving dirt and building a plant. You see it kind of comes up really quickly. By the end of July, we had all of the structural steel was completed. And on October 16th, which is when this picture was taken, the plant was reported as 90% complete. Now, I don't know how they figure 90%, but I'll give it to them. That's what they were saying. So the first employees, so how did, first of all, how did, the plant here in the middle of Kansas, obviously we didn't have a lot of airplanes being built around here at that time. So we didn't really know how to build airplanes. So the first 53 employees that actually came in, they were all here by mid-July of 1941, actually came from the Inglewood plant, which is the picture that you see here. We do have the names of all 53 of those people, but obviously it doesn't fit on the slide. But that's just kind of a breakdown on who they sent over. It was basically people to train the people, that were being hired here. The plant was designed to build about 100 B-25Cs per month. And I point that out, and we'll kind of talk about that here in a second, with the first parts arriving in late June of 1941. So pretty much about the time we weren't even done building the plant, we were already starting to bring parts in. The first 6 were actually in major subassembly form. And then from 6 to 100, the parts that they were shipping was less and less. So basically, everything was coming from California at that point. So November 1st, 1941, we started building our first B-25. So back in July of 1941, we hired our first employee. Now, we were going to build the center section here because it was way too heavy to transport, way too big to transport. So pretty much the only thing we were going to build at the time was just the center section. That is James Bryant, who is working on Old Number 1, which is the first center section jig being built here in Kansas City. He ended up marrying Laura Mae Paget, who was one of the first women to be hired. She worked in industrial relations. It's kind of an interesting thing. Apparently, they met at some point in July or shortly thereafter, and ended up getting married in March of 1942. So first women, let's talk women for a little bit here. First women were hired in January of 1942. When I say I should replace that a little bit. It's not first women, but the first women hired for production. So our first Rosies in particular. And I use that designation a little bit differently than most people do, because obviously we had a lot of people working in administration and stuff like that at the time. But here's those ladies, that's their names there. It's interesting, this picture is actually out of the employee handbook at the time. In February, in March of 42, so right after we started having women working, they realized there was an issue with dress. What do women wear? So they issued a uniform to all the women, which is fine. They were all happy with that. And they used that all the way up until early 44, when they had 2 pages in the book that actually defined what you could, what you should, and what you shouldn't wear as a woman. But interestingly enough, there's one sentence in there that says, it should be noted that the same handbook states work clothes for men are more or less standard. One sentence. So 2 pages about what women should wear, 1 sentence about what men should wear. This is actually our first lead woman. So she became the first female foreman by 1943, and she started in January of 42 as well. Not the first, but definitely one of the first women to work at the plant. So get back to the whole CD thing. Now, a B-25C and a B-25D are absolutely identical. There's no way to tell them apart for the most part, unless you see their serial number. In the case of the first 100, obviously they're completely identical because they came from California and they were intended to be built there. But interestingly enough, North American Aviation was referring to the plant building B-25Cs as late as October of 1941, which you'll remember is right before we start putting them together. But we ended up building about almost 2,290 from December of 41 through March of 44. This is one of those there. Beautiful picture, actually. So let's talk about December 8th, 1941, right? This is the day after Pearl Harbor. I saw this picture in a book one time, and the author was trying to represent this as, oh, these people are so patriotic, they're going, to get a job at the local plant, and, because we had Pearl Harbor attacked. And it's a great story, but it's probably not true. The reality of it is this line was there pretty much all the time. This was the job to have. Remember, we're coming off the recession here. Starting work here gets you at least 50 cents an hour, which was pretty much minimum wage. You could earn up to almost $1.50 an hour as a skilled worker here at the plant, which is 3 times what the normal wage was back in 1941. So we start our first B-25. Miss Greater Kansas City is her name. We started her in November 1st, 1941. We completed her in 12/23/1941. Now, this is actually ahead of schedule. She was not supposed to be completed till pretty much mid-January. So we got her done pretty quick. But because of the attack on Pearl Harbor, literally weeks prior, instead of having a big public, ceremony where everybody would find out where the plant was, they kind of kept it low key, and it was just pretty much an event seen by employees. A few days later, on January 3rd of 1942, they flew her for the first time, and this is her on the ramp. Everybody lining up the plant there, probably kind of hard to see, but everybody lining up the plant there is just the employees from the plant. She stayed throughout the war and was used as a trainer. So this is a picture most people are probably familiar with if you've looked at pictures of B-25s. This is the Kansas City plant. This is kind of what the assembly line looked like early on. This is actually, just looking at that, this is part of the original 100 planes. So all of these parts here came from California. They were having issues in Kansas City putting planes together because the suppliers were unable to supply California and Kansas City at the same time. That's really what kept us building so few bombers. Is their stories about how they had to go out and pull bolts off of the off of the engines so that they could bring them back into the assembly line and get another one off the line. It's some pretty weird things happened with getting parts and pieces in, but it wasn't an issue here in Kansas City. It was an issue with the providers of the subcontractors. So in February of 1942, this is not a picture of one, but we actually got a contract here in Kansas City to build 200 B-29 bombers. That it was almost immediately increased to 300. Now, obviously, the plant that we had built at the time was not big enough. So they approved an expansion project that would create a high bay, and they would be able to build B-25s just like they were, and the B-29 would be assembled in the expanded section. So shortly after that, April 18th, 1942, we had the Doolittle raid. Now, both Keegan and I, holds a very special place in our hearts for several reasons. But it was once called the single largest act of bravery in military history. If you're not familiar, 80 men got into 16 B-25s, which, by the way, are not designed to fly off carriers. You see in that picture there, when these B-25s would actually take off, there was 6 feet of clearance between the outer wingtip and the island on the carrier. So they got into these 16 B-25s. They launched from the USS Hornet to attack Tokyo. Keeping in mind, they launched about 350, 400 miles sooner than they thought. So they knew when they took off that they did not have enough fuel to land on the other side in China, but they did it anyway. But one thing they did prove that it was a great flexible aircraft. So keeping in mind, back here in Kansas City, we had this contract pretty much to double the square footage, add a high bay, add all of this other stuff so that we could build this B-29. But instead, right after the Doolittle raid, they canceled the contract for the B-29 and doubled the contract for the B-25. So basically, they said, we need you to build more B-25s. And they allowed the construction to occur. So the plant was expanded to what more people, kind of see as a familiar picture to them. It took us about a year to get that done. In the meantime, we had our first and only loss of life accident on a test flight. So oddly enough, the 13th B-25 that was built here in Kansas City crashed on a test flight, and all on board perished. This is actually a picture from one of the accident reports. The B-25 History Project actually went out. We located the crash site. We went to actually all of the crew members' burial sites. So we visited all of them and stuff like that. We did a nice report kind of detailing what happened, what went wrong, and that kind of stuff here last year. So it's kind of personal to us, but it was the only time that there was a loss of life crash during a test flight. So after the expansion, this is what most people are kind of familiar with seeing. So this started mid to late 1943, went on through the end of the war. You'll see right in front there's an 8-gun conversion that's being done right there. We'll talk about that here in a second. So that's becomes the new high bay is what we call it. General Motors actually designed it, so it's pretty much exactly like a assembly line you'd see today. You notice down at the bottom, the B-25s are actually on carts. They're not touching the ground at all. They're being pulled with a pulley system on tracks. It's actually really kind of cool. And not only did we increase our production, but we knew that we had to increase our manufacturing. So instead of just putting the center section together, we were now actually manufacturing 60% of that airplane here in Kansas City. That's when production finally took off. Not a great photograph here. We actually, I just located literally this week a construction, one of the original construction engineering drawings for this plant. And I haven't taken possession of it, but I will by this weekend. So that's going to be, we're going to add some detail to that here in a little bit, but kind of gives you an idea. The little building off to the right there is the where they put that's the armament hangar where they put the machine guns and the turrets in them. So really neat kind of way. They had a very unique overhead system. Of course, they had it in California as well, but parts were put together, sub-assemblies were put together in one part of the plant, and then they were carried over through a conveyor system to just precisely the place in the assembly line where they're needed to make them work. You can see here the empennage being dropped on to a B-25 in this particular picture. So peak employment was 24,349 employees. That was October of 43. And by January of 1945, we built 315 planes in that month. So that's pretty amazing considering we didn't have a single computer. Well, we didn't have computers like we know them today. Because of all that great work that we were doing, we were building them faster, we were building more of them, and we were building them cheaper. On October 6, 1944, we were given an Army E-Award, Army Navy E-Award for production excellence. We did win another one literally right before the plant closed, which isn't really discussed too much, that we actually recently discovered ourselves, but we'll be publishing some information on that before too much longer. This is the 30,000th North American airplane. So 30,000th airplane built since the start of the war by North American. It happened to be a B-25J here in Kansas City. We presented it to the Army on October 6, 1944, but to give you just a little idea on the lifespan of these things, it was here and completed in October 6, 1944. It was ferried overseas, and it took it a little while to get where it was going. And it got to where it needed to go by January 13th of 1945. By January 29th, it was scrap metal. Basically what happened was there was a wounded B-25 that was landing, ended up crashing at in the middle of the runway. These guys were already on their final approach, so they went from reducing power to full power and pulled up so that they wouldn't land. That's kind of hard on engines, and that engine went kaput. So they lost both engines actually, and then ditched it in the sea. So in 1945, of course, we're getting really good about building B-25s. We are to the point now where a lot of, really late December of 44, early January 1945, a good percentage, most of the B-25s that we were building were being flown straight to storage. We were getting close to the end of our contract. The government didn't look like it was going to renew it. And that was basically because, we had so many sitting around, didn't really look like we were going to need that many. So there were several workforce reductions over that first 8-month period from January to August. So we'll talk about those here. To keep employees working, we were given a contract on March 2nd for the P-80, which was the most advanced pursuit jet of the day. It was, again, just like the B-29, was supposed to be made alongside the B-25. 2 P-80s were brought into Kansas City. This is one of them here. It was fully assembled and operational. The other one was in pieces. And basically, they started rearranging the assembly line and started working on, how to build these, but we hadn't started building them yet. Of course, now we know that May 8th of 1945, so just a little while later, we have VE Day. So Germany surrendered, right? So now all of a sudden the government's like, well, we don't really need all of these. This is kind of looking like it's going our way. So they canceled our contract literally days later. So at that time, of course, North American knew that they really couldn't, they really had to make another layoff. So basically they got rid of a shift. I like how they said it. They sent a letter to everybody saying that their job, that they would be made available to other industries by termination. So they weren't really fired. They were just made available to go work somewhere else. So then we get into August. So, and this slide's a little confusing for people sometimes. So there's 2 specific VJ days, really. On August 15th, 1945, Japan announced that they were going to surrender. But of course, this picture you see here wasn't taken until September 2nd of 1945. So it took them a couple weeks to get everything together and sign the official declarations. So if you look up VJ Day, you're likely to find September 2nd, 1945, which is not incorrect. But in terms of what we're talking about, August 15th, 1945, the government knew that this war was over. So they canceled the contract for the B-25 on that day. As a matter of fact, everybody showed up for work. They were told to go home, don't call us, we'll call you. They didn't get a phone call, they got a letter. That letter showed up on August 20th, 1945. So pretty much most of the remaining employees were terminated at that point. There was a general that walked in, pointed to a B-25 and said, we'll take from here forward. Turns out that was 72 airplanes. 38 of those were B-25s that had engines that needed to be completed. 34 were actually completed and were waiting for either in the armament hangar getting their guns, or were waiting to get in there to get their guns. Those 72 airplanes would be completed by the last couple thousand people. And the very last one wouldn't be completed until October 15th, 1945. And she was flown out on October 31st, 1945. So here's a picture of her there. So that's the very last B-25 ever built here in Kansas City. So just kind of in summary kind of thing, it was in operation from November 41 to October 45. So for 47 months, we were, quote, building airplanes here, right? We hired our first employee here from Kansas on July 8th, 1941. In total, there were 59,337 employees. We made 6,680 B-25s. Got the breakdown there between Ds and Js. During the war, the Kansas City plant produced more medium bombers than any other plant in the world during World War II. To give you kind of numbers, there were 9,889 B-25s that were built. So roughly 2/3 of those B-25s were built here in Kansas City, not in California. Of that, there's about 150, give or take, known airframes that still exist. 130 of them were built here in Kansas City. Roughly, give or take, 37 are actively flying. All but 2 of those were built in Kansas City. There are 7 more that are being restored to fly currently, and at least 10 others that I've identified that could easily return to the air. As you guys are well aware, it's, we tell people $2,500 an hour to fly. That varies a little bit depending on the price of gas and that kind of stuff, but it makes a pretty decent estimate. So the majority of those that we have obviously are on static display around the world. Fairfax Airport, we started, so we'll kind of end it with that. March 31st, 1985. That's Fairfax Ghost. The number 2 in command of my company actually was the mechanic on Fairfax Ghost. She now flies as Red Bull over in Austria. They were the last B-25 to fly out of Kansas City, out of the Fairfax Airport. They were supposed to be the last airplane to fly out of the airport, but when they did their ceremonial flight, they actually had a malfunction of their nose gear, and they couldn't get a nose gear downlock notification, so they were forced to fly to their other home, their new home, and not land at Fairfax, because obviously if she would have collapsed there on the runway, she would have been disassembled because you couldn't fly her out even if you fixed her. So they chose to land somewhere else, and the last airplane out of the airport was a Cessna 402. Kind of a picture of what it looks like today. If you look kind of like to the left there's a big building. That's the General Motors building today. You can still see the X kind of running through it. That's the runways from the airport. And then over on the right, just straight in the middle on the right-hand side, it looks like a bunch of trees there. That's actually where the plant was. And it was closed on May 8th of 1987, where General Motors closed it and moved into the new plant. And it was completely destroyed when they were demolishing it in a fire, unfortunately. So basically, there's a picture from 1942 on the left and a picture from actually about 5 years ago now. Those are the employee gates there, what the employees would drive to and from to. Reason we took that picture is because about a week after that picture was taken, we took possession of those gates. So we currently have the gates and gate posts in our collection as well. So that's about as fast as I can run over that. And I'm sure Keegan has got a bunch of questions, and hopefully you guys do as well.
Well, thank you for that, Dan. It's really an incredible opportunity to see those old pictures. I know when I was working on the plant history there in Dallas, one of the things I was most jealous of that you all had in your collection was the kind of layout floor plan that assessed how the space had been used. We were almost in opposite situations, you and I, because I still had the building, but no clear understanding of how it was used inside, whereas you had just this incredible compendium of documents that suggested how the building had been used, but no building there to look at. So it's just incredible to see the depth of research. So I'd like to start off by thanking you and the other members of the B-25 History Project for everything that you guys have done to catalog this history and to catalog the history of the airplanes. I know that some of our volunteers are aware of your website. I myself have used it a number of times. It's just a phenomenal resource for finding out about the different airframes and so on that you guys have been able to assemble biographies for. I guess while I wait for some folks to enter their questions into the chat window so that I can read them back to you, I would ask you kind of one startup question, which is you went away and went to pharmacy school and sort of pursued a different career when you obviously have a passion and a love for history. What kind of pulled you back to this? I know you had a family connection to it, but I get the sense that you were away from it for a time and had an opportunity to kind of come back and re-engage with the history.
So it's a great story, and I think I've told you, which is probably why you're asking, but it's not a happy story, quite honestly. So when I was working with my grandparents in the beginning, quite honestly, I didn't get it. I cannot tell you how many times I was standing next to Lieutenant Colonel Travis Hoover, who at the time I had no idea who it was. Yeah, it's Doolittle Raiders. Yeah, whatever. I mean, dude flew the second B-25 off of the, and so I knew him well and really didn't understand the importance of who he was. It was that kind of, I was a kid. I was, 16, 17 at the time, something like that. So when my grandparents decided to kind of hang up the organization, I kind of hung it up with them, quite honestly. And I was a pharmacist by then, was going back to get my doctorate degree and finish up a couple other things. I just had a kid and that kind of stuff, and got to spend a couple of really nice quality years with my grandparents, who I was totally and completely devoted to. And it was pretty tragic after my my grandmother died. Then a couple years later, my grandfather died. Literally 3 weeks after my grandfather died, my mother died. So I was in a pretty bad place, kind of, it was not pretty. And interestingly enough, I had a guy call me up and he said, "Heard you're the bomber builder guy and you know all about the B-25." And I'm like, "Dude, you got the wrong guy." And to be real honest, I kind of hung up on him, kind of was a jerk, but luckily he persisted and he kept calling me and sending me emails and stuff like that and said, "No, I get it. Maybe your grandfather was, the guy we're really looking for, but you're the guy we have." So I agreed to go down and talk with them, and I literally walked into the room. They were going to do an air show, and I walked in the room and I looked around, and it was just a bunch of friends. And one of them was Jim, he's the co-founder of the company, and he and I were talking, and I said, "Gosh, I wish my grandfather was here because he would know what to do." And he knew my grandfather very well, and he just looked at me and he said, "Dan," he's like, "this is a story that has to be told. Your grandfather's not here to tell it. So if anybody's going to tell it, it has to be you." And I tell the story, and I tell people he might as well just slap me upside the face or punch me in the gut or something, because that's kind of how hard it hit me. And I realized he was right, that this story was important and it needed to be told. And my grandparents had dedicated their life to it, and I had kind of helped with that. And it would all die if I didn't get involved, and I couldn't let that happen. So that became my obsession and my life's work. And I tell people now that I'm probably one of the luckiest people on the face of the planet because I know why I was put here. And it's to preserve B-25 history. It's just that simple.
Well, it may be simple, and it's definitely admirable. I do see a bunch of questions have been kind of pouring in.
Cool.
So let's move on to the 8-gun nose. There's a question here from Garrett Brown. What was the reason to convert from bomber to 8-gun nose configuration? And while you're answering that, Dan, tell us why the 8-gun nose has become so special for you and the other members of the project. You basically scoured the earth to source the one that you now, well, I guess you don't have it yet because of the quarantine. Would have been otherwise going to collect.
Yeah, unfortunately, the project was supposed to fly out of here last Saturday, I guess Saturday before last. We were supposed to be driving back with our 8-gun nose, which is literally sitting in the middle of nowhere. But the short answer is, so the 8-gun nose, one of the things they had, and depending on what theater you were in, right? The B-25 was a great bomber, but early on, they had some issues with shipping. They wanted, and obviously trying to drop a 200 or a 400-pound bomb or whatever on a boat from an airplane is pretty darn hard. So they kind of did some modifications. They wanted more forward firepower. Now, originally, the G's and H's, they put a cannon in there thinking, 75 millimeter cannon will take down a ship, and it will. But you're going to get one shot off, and they're definitely going to be shooting back at you. It just didn't work so well. So they developed the 8-gun nose that kind of came from a lot of different places. There were some places that there were some out in the field. They were doing field modifications and throwing extra, 50 cals in normal noses and stuff like that. There's pictures of that out there. So it was basically an effort to get more firepower. Once they did that, they found out that it was tremendously effective against shipping. So that's why it became so popular. It was always a modification. I hear a lot of people call it the J2 modification. That's incorrect. But it was always a modification. Yes, I did show you a picture of one at the plant, but what I didn't tell you is that's actually the modification line that they started at the plant. What you didn't see is when that airplane that had that 8-gun nose on it was sitting there, that a couple of days ago, it had a glass nose on it. They actually put the glass nose on one side of the factory, drove it, built the whole airplane, and then pulled the glass nose off, and then they put this modification on it. Why is it important to us? So a couple of reasons, quite honestly. There is obviously, Show Me is the closest B-25 here. Fairfax goes. Everybody has these, greenhouse noses. But for us, we like the shape and the fact that you can paint them, and the fact that they're just, pardon my French, but they're just badass. When you look at a B-25, especially this picture I've got up here, what makes it look so cool is just all the firepower that it has. So what that 8-gun nose represents is kind of the epitome of how powerful that B-25 was. A lot of people call it the A-10 of the day, and that's actually and completely true. Except for they didn't have the technology to, to build the gun like they did in in the A-10. So we had to put 8 of them up front, plus the 2 on either sides, 9, 10, 11, 12. Plus you can swing the forward turret around, lock it in place. So you've got up to 14 50 caliber machine guns firing at 750 rounds per minute. That's a little bit of lead.
Certainly. That's all great insight there. And I'm sure we all wish you the best of luck with continued efforts to recover that 8-gun nose. I think we'd all agree that that's pretty badass, and we'll look forward to seeing it, because you'll, of course, bring it to the museum at your earliest convenience for a visit, right?
I certainly will.
So we've had another question here from Boom, one of our more senior docents and a pilot here at the museum. Was the ground track that was used to advance the fuselages a GM or North American idea? He notes that it was used in building Vigilantes in Columbus. In my experience, looking at the factory buildings in Dallas, it was recessed chains into the floor and was very reminiscent of something that was actually kind of brought to the aviation industry from the automobile industry. But we'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I actually have a picture of from the plant that shows them actually doing some work on that, where they were actually rearranging the assembly line during the construction, and that is precisely what it is. It's basically chains in the ground that they pulled along with the come along, basically, and it was most definitely a General Motors, and I don't want to call it an innovation, but it definitely came over from the automobile industry. And the funny thing is, when General Motors took over that plant, they still used a lot of the same like overhead conveyors and stuff like that when they were building their cars. So it was quite well designed.
Alrighty, if we're ready for another question, Dave Kahn, one of our volunteers, has noted that a number of the B-25s went directly into storage, as you mentioned in your presentation. Do you have any indication of what happened to those airplanes that went into storage? And perhaps after you've shared your insight, I might share some about having lived in West Texas and found airplane parts out in the middle of the desert.
Well, the short answer to the question is, if you had enough time, I can tell you what happened to every single one of them, but I won't bore you that much. Yeah, so basically what happened is when North American was building them, we put them all into storage. A lot of them sat into storage, and really several things. There were several fates that happened there. A couple of them were actually sold into the civilian market straight out of storage right after the war. Lots of them were sold to scrappers, who then melted them down and made whatever out of. But the government actually brought quite a few of them back out of storage. Later, closer to like 1950, I think there was a few of them that were brought out in 47 range. They started bringing them back out of storage, and two things happened to them there. Some of them they were sold to other governments. Some of them went to Canada, down to Argentina and stuff like that, that actually used them as military aircraft up into the 50s or 60s and 70s, some maybe even later. The other thing that we did with them all the way up even through Korea and Vietnam is they were using B-25s all the way up to about 58 or so, give or take, training pilots. It was a multi-engine trainer. So the B-25 was converted from a war machine into a training machine. So that's what most of your older pilots, kind of trained on.
So what I would add to that is, having lived in West Texas, the word spelled P-Y-O-T-E, Pyote, appears on a great many aircraft record cards from that period. There was a massive storage facility out in Ward County in Texas, where the airplanes were basically lined up alongside of what was a railroad line and a rail line, and ultimately became an interstate. And you can hear stories of people pulling up and gassing up their cars from the airplanes, and the aluminum being smelted down, and all kinds of things. That facility was initially set up with the intention of cocooning airplanes, which was an experimental thought at the end of the war, that what if we needed these again? So they began a cocooning process, but was intended to basically pickle and store the airplanes in extreme dry conditions in the desert. Although when they tried to unpickle a number of B-29s for Korea, they found out they were able to get the airplanes working, but never quite the way they were supposed to. So that process has since evolved significantly. But yeah, the fate of a great many B-25s was actually lined up out there next to the B-29s as well. Dan, we got a really great question here that's comes from Frank McBride that's near and dear to our hearts because of the time we spent looking for these structures. Did North American build housing for their employees, or was there enough in the local area? I guess in this answer, perhaps address kind of what happened to the housing market when North American started pulling in all these employees from rural areas in Kansas into what wasn't a population center at that time.
Yeah, and it still really isn't a population center, quite honestly. Yeah, North American had a huge issue here in Kansas City with housing. There's lots of articles back in the day where people were, renting out a room in their house for $1 a day. Now, that's a lot of money back in the day. Yeah, and a lot of people, $30 a month, people's house payments were less than that, and so it was a big issue, and a lot of people were it wasn't just here, it was everywhere. And there was two developments. There was a public housing development that was built, and there's a private housing development that was built. Both of them still exist to this day, about in as good a shape as the ones that you're familiar with, Keegan, as I know I didn't take you down there. But they did actually try to address that. Now, that housing didn't come around until 1943, so it was pretty rough for a few years. The first 2 years of employment down there, a lot of issues with traffic as people were driving in or taking a trolley, and that kind of thing. So it was something that everybody struggled with, but eventually, it kind of got all sorted out. So did I answer everything? I think I did.
Yeah, I think so. We've got another question here from William Mullis. I've read that North American produced aircraft at a lower cost than other aircraft producers during World War II. Why? Any thoughts on that one?
It was probably us. Just looking at, I can't say a lot about a lot of other manufacturers. I do know that there was a dramatic decrease. Like when you look at the B-25C, you look at a B-25J, a B-25C or D rather is a lot lighter. There's a lot less to it. By the time you get to a J, there's all this armor, there's all these big heavy, and we were building them faster, we were building them cheaper. A lot of that was because manufacturing did is kind of what I've always assumed is just manufacturing and then just mass producing. I mean, we were making really an obscene number of B-25s here in Kansas City, 300 plus a month for almost a year. That's pretty good, considering the size of the plant and the workforce and everything. So that's a great question. I don't know that I know the answer to it, quite honestly.
I have a thought here, which is during the research that I was doing into North American's operations in Dallas, one of the things that was key to their success as a manufacturer was actually that they kind of put the onus for efficiency onto the employees. It's not to say that that wasn't done at other plants, but North American had a rigorous program of issuing rewards for people who found operational efficiencies in how they constructed the airplanes. Yep. So there's the process by which you adhere fabric to the tail surfaces in an S&J was arduous because they had to kind of feel out where the substructure in the control surface itself was before stitching. And famously, they singled out and rewarded publicly there in Dallas the person who said, "Put a light bulb inside." If you shine a light on it, you can see the shadow of the substructure through the surface, and it gives you enough to appreciably shorten the amount of time it takes you to perform the stitching functions.
So that's actually kind of cool that you brought that up, because that is another good thing too. We actually have found they had a program. Anybody that had a suggestion, you would submit your suggestion, and every week they had a winner. The winners would get war bonds. So of whatever amount they deemed it was worth, and of course their name would get printed in the factory newsletter. And so we actually have one of the awards, like a little certificate that they gave them that said, "Hey, your idea for XYZ was so cool, we're going to give you, and all this cool thing. But even more interesting than that, we also have in our physical collection a denial. Gee, it's a great idea, but we've already thought of it, kind of letter. The thing that struck me, as there had to have been hundreds of people every week, putting all these submissions in there, and these letters and certificates and stuff are hand typed by somebody, and it's not like it's, not the form letter. You just don't click and print, you had to type all of this up every single time. Just the amount of work that went into that was amazing in my mind.
So we are drawing to the end of the webinar here. So thank you for those of you still posting questions. We will endeavor to get answers from Dr. Desko and share them with you all after the fact. Lanny, I can address your question right now by saying that North American did ultimately get subsumed into another corporation. It shares corporate lineage with Rockwell and basically, I think, on up to Boeing at this point.
Correct.
So yes, North American did ultimately become part of a number of other corporations in a long and convoluted process. But Dan, I've got one question for you, and it may force you to back out of your PowerPoint and go seeking an image, but North American had a mascot there in Kansas City.
And you want to see Newt, don't you?
You didn't show us a picture of it, so I really think you should.
You want to see Newt, don't you? All right, let me do something here, because I happened. You guys are lucky here. Let's see, is it going to make me log in? Of course it's going to make me log in. This is our digital server. Let's see, Fairfax plant. Let's see here. Newt, there he is. We have a few pictures of Newt. Actually, we know who built him and that kind of stuff. He was actually really kind of cool. Here's one of my favorite ones here. This is Newt. Take a second to pull it up here, maybe. There we go. That's what Newt looks like. He's so ugly, he's cute. Newt still exists. He did survive the war. Matter of fact, he survived to this day. He's actually out at the Wyandotte County Museum. And he's nice and safe there. That's what he looks like. Newt stands for North American Employee Worker Training. He was kind of their little mascot. This is the Kansas plant one. They did all sorts of poor things to Newt, like you wouldn't believe. They even bandaged him up for a poster on how not to get hurt at work. He had a name tag. He had a employee ID. He had a lunchbox. I mean, he went all out. A lot of people are probably familiar with Willie Wingflap. That was the mascot of the California plant. And then we had a bunch of, kind of see as I'm kind of scrolling through here, a bunch of different posters that were hanging around the plant, with different lessons on, how to do and what not to do and that kind of stuff. But we even have images. There's his ID card there. We even have images of when he was carved. He's carved out of wood. That is Leland Lloyd, is the gentleman who carved him. Was actually a soap carver. Did a lot of work at the plant. He was a foreman, I think, by the end of it. He's cute.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. And obviously, it's just phenomenal to see this depth of materials kept alive on, what is now properly maintained archival servers, so that this information is out there for people who are doing research, want to find out more about the plant. Again, thank you to everyone for being here with us this evening, particularly to Dr. Desko for sharing his knowledge and his passion for the Fairfax plant, and for this small piece of history that has such a dramatic impact on how we interpret our collection here at the museum. So thank you again, Dr. Desko. We really appreciate it, and I know I speak for everyone when I say we look forward to passing through this pandemic and having the opportunity to invite you out here to see the B-25, to meet everyone here at the museum, and maybe to deliver this presentation in person so that we can all get a chance to hear it again and share it with others.
Oh, that'd be fabulous. I definitely would love to come out. Wild Cargo is one of the few that I haven't actually seen in person. So she's on my bucket list.
Well, we'd love to host you anytime. With that said, we're going to go ahead and stop the webinar for this evening. So thank you everyone for your time.